This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Can I just ask everyone to make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And can I ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence today from Assembly Member Russell and Assembly Member Polanski is here as substitute. Also apologies from Assembly Member Fortune, and Assembly Member Pigeon is joining us remotely today.
Okay, morning everyone. We've got a couple of quick bits to get through before we get to our main item of business this morning. So we've got declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Noted. Excellent. So that now brings us to our main item of business this morning, which is item 3, our discussion following the Greater London Authority 2024-25 group budget for the London Fire Commissioner. So if I welcome our guests this morning, we have Andy Rowe, who's the Commissioner for the London Fire Brigade. Morning, Andy. We have Fiona Twycross, who is the Deputy Mayor for Fire Resilience at the GLA. Morning, Fiona. And we have Mostaque Ahmed, the Director of Corporate Services at the LFB. Morning, Mostaque. So if I'm going to lead off with the first question, I've got a couple of questions under a sort of subheading of context. So thinking, Andy, about the sort of big picture of where we are with your budget, what were the main challenges that you perceived in setting the budget for the upcoming year, 24-25?
I think it's an extension of a longer process of LFB making sure that it understands its priorities and then focuses on investment to meet those priorities. And what I mean by that is when I took the brigade over in 2020, we were in a position where obviously we'd faced very significant criticism as a result of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, as a result of a highly critical inspection report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue, which pointed to the need for significant investment across pretty much every area of the business, from how we supported our people, to the equipment we used in relation, for example, to high-rise firefighting, to the state of our estate. So it's been an ongoing process, really, of making sure that with that level of investment required, we, on the one hand, deliver savings where there's waste as a general principle, but then seek investment in the areas where we can demonstrate there's actually delivery into communities. So I would say that the challenge, in the general context of a challenging financial environment in the public sector anyway, is the ability to deliver change on the scale that's required, not just by the inquiry, but also effectively our regulator, and quite rightly from our own analysis, but doing so in a way that isn't reckless, recognises that there will be new risks emerging. So if we think about kind of wildfire and flood, even if I think of last weekend and what happened in Hackney Wick, so balancing emerging risk against known weaknesses within the organisation that need rectifying, but ensuring that we don't just look at it as perhaps we used to when I first took over, intermittently, but almost continuously, so we can flex with that. So that perhaps presents the overall picture. And the picture really is to use our CRMP to drive change and to use investment in that context, whilst responsibly seeking to achieve a balanced budget, quite obviously, in respect to proper use of the public purse.
Okay, so in terms of sort of some of those obviously are continuing themes from last year, as you've said. One of the things that you said to the committee, it was sort of this meeting 12, but it was 13 months ago in the previous budget cycle, was about the uncertainty around sort of for example, the personal emergency evacuation plans and so on emerging from Grenfell, and you said that was a potential new cost pressure that might introduce new obligations, new costs. Is there any more clarity now on that than there was a year ago?
Not on that point specifically. So I think there's greater clarity generally about the cost of making sure that LFB has responded in totality to the recommendations arising from the Grenfell Tower inquiry in phase 1. So we'll be the only governmental organisation to complete all 29 of the recommendations laid against us, actually on January the 31st. And that will be reflected in central government reporting, I'm led to believe. Obviously, that means we've priced that in, the cost of that. And that cost is very significant. It runs into the millions, as this committee will be aware of, because we've effectively had to change our entire training approach across the workforce. We've had to change our entire approach to fire safety regulation. We've had to buy new equipment in. That's priced in. There are some further changes that we can reasonably anticipate out of phase 2 of the inquiry, which does include, in a way, the part of the journey that's begun with PEEPs and the setting up of the building safety regulator. The outcomes of that are still not entirely certain because they relate to recommendations that fall to central government and new bodies such as the building safety regulator to deliver. But what I can assure the committee is that they are, to their credit, not operating in isolation. We are in with them continuously. You know, we've had round tables with colleagues in DLUC. You know, we meet on a weekly basis with colleagues from the Home Office. So we are aware of what likely costs may be. And I think some of the pressures we had anticipated around PEEPs, for example, have reduced because the building information system we've got that speaks partly to that recommendation but also to others is in place and is operating well and has actually allowed us to pull back and reevaluate some of where we thought we were going to have to make investment, and we're likely to actually make some efficiencies in the context of things like the One Risk programme, for example. So sorry, it's quite a long answer, but it's not entirely certain where that cost might land, but we're working continuously to understand it, and I don't actually think it's going to be extreme in the context of the overall budget of LFB. The general pressure around fire safety is something different, which I think we will probably get to later in the committee.
Okay. No, well, that answers the question really about the uncertainty. There's some uncertainty, but the scale of it is shrunk, so that's useful to know. And you know, thinking about other uncertainty, staff wage increases. So you have an assumption of 3% built into the draft budget. Is that a realistic assumption, and how might that play out, and what impact might that have? If
I think it's realistic, but the caveat on that is we, like colleagues in policing and health, are subject to national agreements in relation to pay. So whilst we have a voice in that, we don't have a deciding voice. We're one of over 50 other fire and rescue services, and we don't get additional weighting for our size. So we effectively have to negotiate with the sector before we even get to a position where the sector then negotiates with the Fire Brigades Union in relation to firefighter pay. That process is complex with many voices in it. I think it's worth noting that the local government settlement, whilst I think has definitely meant we're well supported in London from the Greater London Authority, it is more contentious in other areas of the country. So I think it will be difficult for local authorities certainly to move beyond 3%. That's definitely what I'm hearing back from inside the sector. But I think, again, in due courtesy to our colleagues in the Fire Brigades Union, who sit on the opposite side of the table with all the legal rights that they get as part of that negotiating process, would quite rightly say, well, actually, all of this is subject to national negotiation. So what we've done is set a budget at a level in relation to inflation that we think is reasonable, takes into account the many other factors, including, frankly, other people's finance outside of London, but with the caveat that that could be subject to change on the basis of national negotiation. And obviously we've seen that in other years, but we think that's fairly realistic.
And if so, it's a national pay award that, as you say, you're more of a witness to than a participant in, effectively. That's the sort of picture between, I guess, it's between the Home Office.
No. So
how
it sits within
work?
local government. So for fire, because fire is effectively funded by, well, for the purposes of this question, fire in relation to pay is effective through the local, is funded through the local government settlement.
Okay.
Therefore, there is a National Joint Council, NJC, for negotiating firefighter pay rather than an independent pay review body you see in other sectors. And it is the custodians of that for the sector are the Local Government Association. So it's LGA negotiators who act on behalf of the sector to effectively sit in a room with union negotiators and seek a settlement on behalf of the entire national sector, including the devolved administrations. And that's what will be, that's the beginning of that process now. So there'll be early meetings now to discuss. We're fed into those meetings, our views have been expressed, and then the negotiation will unfold from there. That's how it operates. So although we have a voice, it's perhaps more of a voice than, say, an independent pay review body would be able to give. But we are still very much in the hands of negotiators and the wishes of over 50 other fire and rescue services.
Okay. So is it tied to the local government settlement, or is it a separate settlement but part of the same negotiation?
The local government settlement effectively is what will pay for whatever comes at the end of it. So what fire gets within the local government settlement will have to fund it, but the process of negotiating pay itself sits entirely separately from that.
Okay.
So whilst it has to pay countenance to it, actually, again, the union would quite rightly argue that they're negotiating in the context of what they think their members deserve to receive, and will approach it on that basis. And then therefore it's incumbent on individual fire and rescue services to use their budget to fund what in the end will be a national settlement.
Yeah.
And we have seen that settlement sometimes come out of step for what is available in certainly some local authority budgets.
I mean, that makes sense. I was just thinking that it would be odd for it all to be tied together. In terms of, I mean, you've just come on to what I was just going to ask, actually. So I think your staff and pensions budget is like 86% of your total budget. So in terms of if that goes up or down, that's most of the budget moving up or down. So if that does go, you made a provision of 3%. If it comes in higher, where does that leave this budget?
This budget would be okay. I mean, do you want to? We've thought about this,
yes,
because it would be completely irresponsible if we didn't. Yeah. So please, Mostaque.
Thank you. So each 1% change in the pay assumption costs overall for the workforce about 4 million. Obviously, the bulk of that is firefighters, but if we assume that we follow a similar clause for the non-operational staff. So that will be the size of the impact. Obviously, if it ends up being more than 3%, then for the final budget in March, we would have to look at prioritising. If there was no additional funding, obviously we would have those discussions about potential additional funding, but we would have to look across our budget to identify prioritisation, perhaps rephasing some growth areas to accommodate that as well. Okay. And it's also worth noting that this year in our budget, we've talked about just now the core pay assumption. We have also built in skills payments for hard to recruit areas, specialist areas in operation areas, which has been a long-standing issue where in attracting people to those posts which are needed to protect Londoners. Which require high levels of acquisition, skills training and maintenance of those skills. So that's an innovation within our budget as well. And the final point I'll make on pay is on the non-operational side. So this is the professional support services. We have faced some challenges in recruitment and retention, for example, in areas such as procurement and finance, where we're competing against markets. So we have got a review as well of the competitiveness of our overall offer for those professional support services as well. So
so just so I'm certain, I'll come to you in a second, Fiona, so you're indicating. Just so I'm clear in my own mind, so you've got 3% assumption. That's subject to a national negotiation and award, but the pay award would not come with additional money. You would have to find the additional cost, if there is one, from within the budget total that you have here.
That quite rightly is the starting assumption from my colleagues within the Greater London Authority. What it would mean, though, is that we would have to, I think, slow down or stop some of the investment activity. That's the reality of this, because most of the bulk of the committal of money into outside of the pay budget, the big numbers sit inside the change programme. So it might be about slowing down some of the changes to training. It might be about looking at the level of investment we're putting into change around culture, for example. So not things that we particularly want to do, but we could reasonably phase as long as we understand the risk. And that may well be the approach we need to take in order to ensure that we meet our obligations, in terms of managing the finances of the London Fire Brigade appropriately. Okay. But what we will be clear about, because I think we're in a different place from where we were in 2020, is that we will understand the impact of doing that. And we will therefore understand what it means about our ability to deliver against the CRMP, and we will be clear when we articulate that risk, because all of these decisions naturally come with risk either way, don't they? So I think that's the position we're in, but that would be our starting assumption, along with going back again, as we have done kind of relentlessly really since we changed the way we look at our finances to where we might achieve efficiencies. What I would say, and I think I need to be clear really on behalf of Londoners and firefighters, is that where we would not seek to find those savings is within the overall makeup of our operational estate and numbers, because I think we're in a position with emerging risk and what we're seeing particularly around the built environment and then respect to climate, where it would be injudicious of me as Commissioner to suggest that there might be some easy answers by closing fire stations or removing appliances. I am not of that mind. I think they have to be safeguarded at all costs. We do a quarter of all fire and rescue service calls in the UK on a daily basis, over 210,000 a year. We hold all the risk in pretty much every metric in comparison to other force areas. We're very, very different. I'm not in a position where I would not honour both the Mayor's manifesto commitment, but more importantly, our own operational risk assessment for what we need in terms of resourcing. So we would not seek it there, and I need to make that clear, because otherwise I think I'm doing both Londoners and firefighters a disservice.
Okay. Thanks, Andy. I appreciate that. Thanks, Mostaque. Fiona, you wanted to come in on that question.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, so 2 points on the pay negotiations. Just for transparency with this committee, it is not guaranteed that we will have a conclusion of the pay negotiations by March. These processes tend to work fairly slowly. They involve a lot of consultation, and it also, in regard to the firefighter pay, the pay year is from July the 1st. So we don't have a history of this being agreed neatly within the budgetary process, which actually also presents additional problems for a lot of the county brigades that are funded through county council. So that additional element causes some issues in terms of absolute transparency on what the pay bill might be for the coming year. The other point is on the skills payment, which is about righting a historic wrong, really, which is there's no other profession that I've come across where you train, you acquire additional skills that are valued by the organisation and valuable to the population, where you don't have additional skills-based payments. So we're very keen to address this. And unlike the national pay negotiations, this is something that we can have localised negotiations on, which sort of removes some of that uncertainty in the national picture. So I think that's really positive, and I hope the committee supports the principle as well.
Okay.
Thanks.
Before, I see you're indicating, Andy. Just quickly on, I was going to ask you, Fiona, about obviously, is there any possibility of the GLA supplementing? So obviously we spoke about there's a national pay award. Is there any scope for the GLA budget to supplement pay? And you've sort of hinted at a possibility of where there might be, but perhaps not. So
no, I definitely didn't hint that there might be. I think that that was the case last year, and actually the Mayor's additional input into the finances for funding last year was one of the factors in averting a fire strike. So I think there's no intention at this point for us to supplement that for the national pay negotiations. What the LFB can do and what is being sort of worked into the final budget plans would be that piece around skills payment, which is one of the areas of firefighter pay that can be negotiated on a localised basis as part of the approach negotiations. We can't go beyond we got into quite a lot of trouble last year when Andy and I suggested we go beyond the national negotiations for the core pay element of firefighter pay.
So, sorry, perhaps I appreciate I don't sit on the fire committee, so I'm less familiar with this area than perhaps some. But just for my own benefit then as an ignoramus, so there is a mechanism that you used last year for GLA funds to supplement the LFB, or what?
It wasn't that straightforward. So we ended up with an impasse nationally through the pay negotiation. And to try to resolve that impasse, the Commissioner did what I think was quite an excellent job in terms of negotiating sort of a way forward that we then used to lever a national change in position. But I think that we pushed it beyond what quite a lot of other colleagues on the National Joint Council, which is the body for collective bargaining, were comfortable with. So there's no intention to do that this year. And I think that we also don't have any identified funds to supplement the 3%. Should it go beyond that, we would have to go and look at efficiencies, as the Commissioner has indicated. So I hope that clarifies that.
Well, I'm conscious that you want to come in, Andy, but I'm not sure that I'm clear. So it is possible for GLA money. I mean, possible in a theoretical sense. It's not illegal. It's not banned. It's not impossible for GLA money to go in to the LFB. But I hear what you're saying, that the Mayor does not intend to do it. It's not budgeted. There's not earmarked funds. I hear that clearly. But it is, in theory, possible for that to happen, and that did.
Yes,
that has
there's nothing that prevents that happening in terms of a legal boundary or some sort of corruption of finance regulation. Just to give a bit of context around what, quite rightly, the Deputy Mayor has explained, is one of our motivations for leaning into the national pay process is that in London, if there is an industrial dispute, because of the level of risk in London, we have to have contingency arrangements. We have to legally anyway, but the difference between 210,000 calls a year and in some other smaller force areas very close to London where you might get 15 or 20 calls a day, your contingency arrangements have got to be rock solid. Those contingency arrangements, when they're stood up, cost us over £1 million a day, potentially. So you very quickly, over a periods of protracted industrial disputes, start to cost an enormous amount of money to London and Londoners that is simply irrecoverable. You know, it's just money that's gone. So therefore, anticipating really quite extraordinary costs, which I fully accept isn't reoccurring revenue, but does create extraordinary risk for Londoners, felt to us like a good reason to try and avoid a national pay dispute. So we did lean in. I've got to say, both the politics and the finances as we come into this financial year ahead mean I think it'd be very difficult for us to repeat that, actually, because of the financial picture outside of London. And I'm not sure you can do it more than once anyway, potentially within the context of the negotiating environment we're in. I'm still very keen to avoid an industrial dispute in London because my experience of it, again, if we look at the outcome of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which points very clearly to what in many ways were described as wasted years in industrial dispute, where we were looking inwards rather than outwards to communities, means that there's a greater cost than just the money as well. It's relationship, your ability to deliver the service. So whilst I am focused on that, and I would do everything to avoid a national dispute, I think everything the Deputy Mayor has said is correct, which is we have no anticipated route to additional GLA funds, and I completely understand why GLA colleagues, you know, in an equally difficult environment would make that point very clear. But there is nothing that might stop the GLA stepping in potentially at a later point. But I think we've got to let the national negotiation process unfold. Again, to provide some assurance to this committee, in relation to skills payments, we are looking very closely at the aligned national negotiating process, because my experience of this is what London does now, for example, what we did around marauding terrorist attack and skills payments, may well then get discussed at a national level. So anywhere where we seek local agreement, we responsibly place a caveat into the workforce agreement that says if this is then superseded by a national agreement which recognise skills payments, and there are working groups at a national level looking at exactly this issue, then we will take that into account and revert to the national agreement, which is also the desire of the FBU. So we're doing stuff in alignment. So even though we're doing something locally, what we're not doing is something reckless that is out of step with the national view of this. And indeed, we've spoken to central government about our direction of travel, so it's not coming as a surprise. And we will need to articulate why we've done things to the regulator as well, the inspectorate. So it's just to provide this committee with that assurance that we're not doing anything here that isn't in plain sight of our inspectorate, nor justified against the risk. And I suppose my final point on the skills payments, which I'm sure you might come to, is
should we come back to that later?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just conscious that
because there's some aligned savings.
I'm not the only person on the committee who might have some questions, and some people may specifically want to ask about that. Just on, I suppose the context to me asking that is obviously that 24 hours ago everybody thought that there would be no tube running today, and this morning lots of us have used the tube because the Mayor suddenly found £30 million to pay TfL extra money that wasn't available 24 hours ago and then suddenly was, and now there's no tube strike. And you've just set out very clearly why a fire brigade strike would be at least as damaging, probably more so. And so the motivation, and it's still an election year, of course, and so the motivation for the mayor to suddenly find money obviously is quite high. So I hear what you're saying about there's no plan, but obviously the mayor has suddenly found money for TfL, and I imagine some other people in other industries are looking at that and going, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point to make. I suppose what I'd come back to, which is where the Deputy Mayor has made a response as well, is that this is very much a single union-driven negotiation process sitting at a national level. So actually the drivers for settlement sit predominantly outside London. Whilst I might seek to avoid a strike in London, the reality is that the drivers sit well outside London, and the biggest constraint to it going beyond the 3% as we're looking at it is actually the state of local government finance outside London. And and that's where despite the fact that we hold a lot of firefighters obviously in London in the workforce, the bulk of the workforce is outside of London. So that the primary factor is driven there. So whilst we did have an impact last year, we were also supported in that tent by other large metropolitan brigades who in combination kind of leaned into the national negotiating process. And the devolved nations. I'm not sure, looking at the rest of the country, whether that's the same now.
Okay.
Really.
That's right.
So Mostaque, I just, before I hand over to colleagues, two, I hope, quite quick, sort of more technical questions. One is about risks with the firefighter pension scheme and how they've been factored into the actuarial valuation that we see in the budget.
Yes, so we do have obviously periodic reviews of the actuariation. In fact, one is happening right now at the moment. Ourselves and the sector would be looking for Home Office funding to cover that, because that's where the funding source for that element of our finances comes from. So in the light of that result, obviously we'll be discussing with Home Office to ensure that gets, from our perspective, fully covered.
Okay, so that presents a risk for this year, though, because that valuation will come back presumably in the next few months.
Yes, but we will obviously engage with Home Office because we get grant funding for that element.
Okay, right. So okay, understood. And then finally, thinking about the overtime, and this is something that's been it was sort of quite low, and then it shot up significantly. I think it was 12 million last year or the year before, and now it's come down significantly. Projecting that it stays down. Are you confident that the pre-arranged overtime situation is set to remain, more in the sort of 4-ish million range?
Yes, I would hope that we do better than even that. So you're absolutely right. Obviously, the origins of this go back to a range of factors, but one of them was in terms of the recruitment freeze we had during the COVID period, but also sickness levels, skills, shortages, training, and all those factors. And what we did have was last year, in terms of outturn, the overtime kind of overspend was around £12.5 million. As at quarter two, we're just getting the quarter three figures shortly. That's gone down by about £8 million in terms of forecast for this year. So it is a substantial reduction, but nevertheless, we think there's more we can do. The measures we've taken in terms of training, skills payment will help as well in terms of some of those areas, but also recognising that filling our vacancies, making progress on that in terms of vacant margin also has an impact on reducing that bill for overtime. And the final area also is obviously taking actions to address sickness, because that impacts on firefighting availability, like other sectors, where we've seen an increase post-COVID. So we've done well to reduce the overtime bill, but I wouldn't say it's a finished business. We've got more to do to keep that under control and improve it further.
Understood. Okay, Andy, you want to come in?
Yeah,
I think very quickly.
I just want to be
overtime question.
Just absolutely clear with this committee that I didn't enjoy my committee appearance. I think it was both the first and second appearances in front of this committee as Commissioner where we were in a place where, frankly, I didn't feel, from my perspective, we did have control of our operational overtime. There's never going to be a time when I am comfortable with operational overtime spend. I think that leads to complacency. I just want to offer some credit, really, to Mostaque in having done an enormous amount of work with our Central Operations Department in bringing that down. That is not something that's happened by accident. It's almost continual scrutiny under some fairly significant pressure. So whilst you might not immediately think about the protest policing as having an impact on us, it does. We are unfunded. So we throw a lot of operational resources and planning to supporting the safe conduct of, quite rightly, the democratic right to protest in London. But we don't get funded for that in the same way that policing colleagues do. You know, we have to build that into our operational overtime. To have done that as one singular example and still bring the overtime bill down has required a lot of work. But that will have to carry on, because I've seen in my own time as Commissioner how easy it is to lose control of that. Do not intend to go back to that place, and I think the committee is absolutely right to hold us to hard account on it. I welcome the fact that you come and challenge, because it has been one of the helpful drivers in, you know, getting us to a better place. And we can still do better, I think.
Thank you. Well, it's a significant improvement. It's about in the region of £8 million, isn't it? So what's that? 5%. Okay. Next couple of questions, still on staffing, from Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. I wanted to pick up the cultural review, because when you were before us previously, Commissioner, you said working through the costings now, people are working on those sums. And when I look at the detail, I see 150,000 external cost pressures in relation to the culture review, and then another line, 405,000 investment in accessibility and reasonable adjustments, active life cycle management for devices, software, user support. Not really clear what all that means. So can you unpack that for us? What money is being spent to fully implement the culture review, and what's it actually mean in reality?
I can, yes. I managed to get to, I've got a lot of tabs on this folder, but I have got to the right one. So the cost of the initial work and the report itself cost in the region of £160,000. That included not only the time of Nazir Afzal, but that of his team, of which there were up to 7 people. Following the recommendations made by the review, funding was approved for £1.4 million to set up and maintain an external complaints provision, but that's not just complaints reporting, it's also the investigation and specialist investigation that follows it. And to set that in a context, you know, we had an internal whistleblowing line, effectively, in the year before that took 22 calls. Since December the 1st in 2022, we've had well over 340 calls into that complaint line, 84 live investigations, multiple misconduct hearings, 13 people exited from the organisation. That number will rise, many others sanctioned at another level. So that we're talking about the overall cost of investigations, and then dealing with the outcomes of all of that process. That's what that £1.4 million is. As part of the transformation process of people services, also referred to in culture review and in inspection, we've actually set up a new in-house professional standards unit, first in the country for a fire and rescue service. That's live now and is getting its kind of teeth into the transition process of reducing cost in the CMP external provision of investigation, taking investigation in-house while still maintaining a specialist external complaints and, more importantly, independent reporting line. We've budgeted a cost of £250,000 for that, which you can already see is a lesser cost over the 3 years starting 1st of January 24. I welcomed the support of other committees and colleagues from across the political spectrum in helping us achieve a legislation change that allows fire and rescue services to vet people properly, like health and policing. That's going to cost us £300,000, though, to implement within the context of the budget cycle coming forward. One of the most significant criticisms that arose from culture review and from inspection was around our ability to communicate our values and, most importantly, build them into face-to-face leadership training. That is £900,000. With support from the Mayor, we secured investment for improved maternity provision. You know, our women's staff network and the union described our previous maternity provision, I think correctly, as medieval. 15 weeks in one of the most physically high-risk and taxing occupations in the UK. That has a budget of £2.8 million for 23-24 and 24-25, and I would hope that would encourage more women to consider a career in the fire service. And as part of the budget process, we've aligned those investment requirements to the CRMP. That's the point of CRMP, really, is that we've built culture review into it. And there are a number of projects framed under what we call Programme 5, which is simply a number programme around the project delivery that helps us to deliver the CRMP. The total investment in 24-25 of 2.85 million, which helps to deliver cultural change. But what I would say is cultural change, when people start talking about culture, it feels like something abstract, I think, sometimes. The reality is cultural change is what you need to do to ensure that at 3 o'clock in the morning, faced with something like Grenfell, someone makes the right decision in the context of their leadership, their values, sometimes in very highly compromised environments, and that the investment we place in face-to-face training or driving behaviours will in the end actually probably reduce costs, I would suggest, to Londoners in all sorts of different ways, both financial and the terrible effects of taking the wrong decision. So I hope that gives you a sense of kind of the overall metrics of culture. It doesn't come for free, but I wouldn't apologise for that, frankly, because I know it's something we need to address, because it runs, unfortunately, as a thread through all the criticism LFB has faced from the point that we were exposed in the Grenfell Tower inquiry.
Yeah, thank you. Some of the figures you've given me are over several years. That final Programme 5 was 2.85 million. Is it within that, all of those other areas you talked about around in-house professional standards unit and so on? Does that cover that, or are they separate?
Mostaque.
Thank you. It's a mixture. So Programme 5 that the Commission referred to includes some of those things. For example, the leadership training, the DBS kind of vetting, uniform, and associated people kind of services transformation. But there is also work that's happened kind of outside of Programme 5, recognising that actually culture needs to be kind of embedded throughout the organisation in all departments. So, for example, the figures around maternity pay were actually in our final budget for last year. They built into the base. It costs about 1.5 million a year going forward. So we built that into our final budget last year. I think also another example where we've got investments related to broader cultural issues outside of the core Programme 5 is in IT. So we've got in our investment proposals in the IT department just over £400,000 to enable better service to colleagues who require reasonable adjustments, whether that's physical or neurodiverse. It's about software changes, hardware, accessibility. It's also about the service and support provided by the IT department. So that's a £400,000 ongoing investment.
405, yeah.
Okay, I mean, if I could perhaps come in as well, because I think that Mostaque's touched on a point that's quite important we might get to anyway in terms of capital funding, is I think I have to recognise the baseline from where we started. So we're talking, there can be no more totemic example of why culture change is important in terms of investment than our estate. So we have been able to employ women firefighters since 1985, when there was a change in legislation in London to support that. It took until 2021 when I got the support of the Mayor to sign an executive order to actually put enough toilets and private dormitory space in to ensure dignity for both sexes. That points to the lack of serious investment in this space, because quite often people talk about culture and you end up getting played into what is quite a hyperbolic kind of external debate. In the London Fire Brigade, there was some just real physical inadequacies that were systemically unfair. You can't claim to want to employ women if you don't give them enough toilets. It's that basic. So we have had to put money in, and that's kind of how I explain it to firefighters, actually, who are also our harshest critics, and quite rightly, and will say, well, why are you spending money on that instead of a fire engine? Well, actually, just having enough toilets at work is quite important, but it is significant across 103 fire stations. So we're trying wherever possible to focus, prioritise spending, not on something that's a bit exotic and ephemeral, but real things that make a change to decision making, the safety of people in the workplace, frankly, or just their physical facilities, or their uniform even.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. It's astonishing. The more I hear about all of this and the more you tell us. What do you have a final kind of cost for this coming year of what you think the culture review recommendations and everything you're doing in that space is going to come to?
I think if we added up the totals we just gave you, it covers pretty much everything. But I think what it points to is the fact that because it's across a number of areas, I think we should provide that in writing to you, because I think it's an entirely...
It might be helpful if you could. I just
100%,
think it's such an important piece of work to actually understand the scale of investment that's needed to turn this around. So I think that would be really helpful.
Mostaque, so
absolutely, we can do that. And it's also recognising that some of this investment started before we had the independent culture review. For example, the Commissioner talked about Privacy for All, which is the programme in stations about facilities for all. And that was a 10 million investment approved before the culture review came along. But what we did since the culture review is obviously put more investment in to supplement that, to accelerate it. So, but we can set out the totality, because the budget sits across large areas of the brigade's different departments, but we can pull that together.
Thank you. And then, Mostaque, I wanted to ask about the average vacancy margin. I think last year's budget anticipated an average of 0. This year's draft includes a current forecast of 100 average vacancy margin. Can you talk us through what's caused this change? And you mentioned earlier that filling vacancies actually has an impact on obviously your overtime budget as well. So these two areas are clearly linked.
If I could perhaps start before bringing Mostaque in on the detail of the figures. So the reality is we've done some analysis that's looked back across years actually of the brigade. We are still planning to get to 0, but the reality is we probably never will because of the contractual rights of firefighters. I would have to effectively over-establish by 100 the whole time, which would be unjustifiable cost to the public purse, because firefighters have a national contract that gives them the right to provide a week's notice, which they frequently exercise, actually, which you would, wouldn't you? You want that flexibility, I guess, as an individual firefighter. It's just very, very difficult to plan establishment in that context. So subject to that, we've looked back over the years where we've done really well with recruitment and where we've managed the skills kind of balance well, and there are periods where we've done that. We have never done better than about an 80 to 100 vacancy margin. So we are planning on the assumption that we will do everything we can close to 0, but it's reasonable to assume that at any given moment, through a combination of kind of people transferring out at short notice or taking their option to retire at a week's notice, we never really reasonably get beyond about 100, and that's kind of priced into the budget moving forward and always has been there. It's how they previously set kind of the anticipated level of operational overtime, which has always been there in the budget. It's just we've always massively exceeded predictions because we weren't managing the workforce planning well enough, speaking frankly. So that 100 isn't because we want to... If I wanted to maintain a planned 100 vacancy margin, I'd end up with 200 down or 300 down. So I have to seek to achieve 0 to get possibly on average 80 to 100 the whole time. I think is the best way of putting it.
Yes, so it is more, so absolutely, it's not a target, it's a realistic forecasting assumption which has an impact on the budget. We are making progress in getting towards that. So the latest figures I have at end of December 2023 was we had operational vacancies of 188. So if I compare that to April 2022, that was 307. And I understand before my time during COVID, we had even higher numbers there. So we are on a trajectory of getting towards that. But the reality of both in terms of the notice periods that the Commissioner talked about, but also the time to recruit means that realistically actually getting below 100 is very difficult. And as a proportion of our establishment of firefighters, 100 is about 2%. That would be pretty good for an operational organisation to get to that level. Obviously, we want to fill every vacancy as we can, but that's really a forecasting assumption.
Yeah, and is there any work going on as part of these national negotiations, or has there been in the past, to move it from 1 week to 1 month? I mean, 1 week is completely unrealistic for any organisation. It's bad enough when someone gives you a month's notice. Or is that just something that is too toxic to go near?
I'm not aware of any intention to address that particular part of the firefighter contracts. I think there are probably bigger priorities within the negotiating space around actually skills payments and understanding about how the role of a firefighter is changing in the face of emerging threat, which I know are live discussion. So as far as I'm aware, they're not looking at that part of it because they would like to sort out other bits of what is now quite an old contract model, stretching back many years. Actually, what you've kind of raised there, though, does take us back to some of the other areas around workforce planning. So I think it's very easy to focus on the baseline numbers of firefighters. Actually, the thing that can take our very important operational resources off the run, as we would say, is your officer numbers. And they're here and employed, but it's having the right numbers of officers with the right skills, your specialist skills. So actually there's another big hidden piece which has nothing to do with baseline recruitment, but is all about making sure we train the right people in the right place, because that has a massive impact on our overtime bill. At one point, our fire rescue units, and there's only 14 of them in London, represented nearly 25% of our overtime bill. Now we've massively improved on that, but it's still not good enough. So sometimes the focus where we talk about recruitment really should be on how we use our training model to ensure there isn't gaps in specialist skills and how we incentivise people to be in that space. That's equally important in terms of keeping our kind of OT budget down and making sure resources are available.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I don't see any indication, so we'll move on to the next section, which is efficiencies, savings and use of reserves. We're starting off with Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Commissioner Andy Rowe on your award that you received as part of the New Year's Honours List from the King. Thank you. My first question is just on the LFB's reliance on reserves and the usage of reserves. So how will you address the LFB's usage of reserves on its balance to balance the 2024-25 budget and to reduce the budget gap in 25-26?
So again, it's just a similar answer to the kind of challenge around overtime, which is I had a couple of very uncomfortable experiences, I think rightly in front of this committee, where we didn't clearly have, when I first took over, enough of a plan about how we would use reserves that recognised both the drive from central government. So to be clear, both the current minister and the previous minister have written to me, as they have every other chief in the country, to urge us to use what is a fairly considerable level of reserve holdings across the national fire sector. So as a sector, we hold quite large reserves. I have written communication from my colleagues in central government that say, please go and use that before you start seeking additional funding, for example, in respect to any ring-fence grants around fire safety, which I'm very grateful they do provide, by the way, but they quite rightly said to us, please go to your reserves first before you come back for more money. So there is a general direction from central government that we should plan to use our reserves, but we quite clearly need to do that responsibly so we don't leave ourselves exposed in terms of running them down totally. In that context, we've thought very carefully about how we use reserves, what we use them for, and I'm going to pass to my colleague, if that's okay, to give you a detailed answer about how we look at our different reserve holdings within the overall kind of budget and then how we responsibly use them while maintaining some contingency.
Thank you. This is absolutely critical element of ensuring, in terms of my statutory duties as Chief Finance Officer, that actually we've got a sustainable kind of financing model. And it is about getting that balance right between ensuring reserves are adequate to manage risks and priorities, whilst also guarding against kind of excessive build-up, because good financial management, as well as the minister said, it's not good use of taxpayers' money to ask for more funding when you're holding reserves and not using them. So it's getting that balance right. And at the core of our kind of reserve strategy is the fact that we have a general reserve for those contingencies, which is about 3.5%, and we've maintained that through the period. Beyond that, we do have earmarked reserves, and those reserves were set up for specific purposes. And we look to ensure that they're used for that purposes. But if situations change where actually that purpose is no longer required, then again, good financial management says you look at that if it's no longer required and you release it or use it for another purpose. And that's what we've done through a review of our earmark reserves, where we have a number of reserves which were in place for many years which weren't being used, and therefore it was right to review those. The LFB also had an additional category which is kind of somewhere between a general reserve and an earmark, which is called the Budget Flexibility Reserve. Now, this reserve was set up before my time, but I've looked back at previous budget submissions on papers and agreements. It was set up for the financial year 2017-18 initially. It was 11 million, just over 11 million then. And at the time, it was set up to deal with an expected short-term funding gap. And it was thought that within 2 years, it will be used up. In reality, what's happened is it's lasted far longer than that. I mean, our submission shows that we still have a balance. In the initial years, we ended up supplementing that when we had surpluses in the previous years. But more recently, we have used it to deal with exceptional inflationary pressures, time-limited pay pressures, whilst we develop a sustainable budget model to deal with those issues. So, the budget flexibility reserve is coming down, but that's largely because a lot of those pressures, like pay, we're building into base budgets. So overall, what I would say is we have and continue to kind of review our reserve strategy to make sure it is sustainable, is adequate, but also not excessive, and it's getting that balance right.
And what alternatives were looked at in terms of not spending the reserves and finding other sources or pots of money? I mean,
the alternatives always for reserves is looking at whether we can make other savings efficiencies, whether we can rephase some of our investments, as the Commissioner said, or seek more funding. So it's in that wider context, we have presented a budget proposal that does have savings efficiencies built in, does have investments to enhance our service to London, etc., and has targeted use of reserves as part of that overall balanced picture. So use of reserves has a role as long as it's done in a planned way and with a view to long-term sustainability.
So just on some of those earmarked reserves that have been moved over as such or have been repurposed because they're no longer required. I think I saw on your budget line there's about £4.5 million of these earmarked reserves that are no longer needed for the reason that they were earmarked for. Can you give us a flavour of how they are being repurposed in this year's budget, just so that we have the assurance that it's not being put into recurring funding that leaves an issue, obviously, in next year's budget?
Sure. Example is, for example, the reserves for the compensation reserve, for example, because we've got a base that built with a base budget. It doesn't make sense to have that as the same level of time-limited reserve, because where we've got something in the base budget. CRMP is another one where clearly we have used the CRMP reserve for time-limited investments, but where we have a lot of the investments that we talked about, for example, related to culture review, maternity pay, for example, and other investments like leadership training, our budget proposals have built them in because they're recurring investments. So therefore, we've switched that from a time-limited funding to build it into base budget as well.
I mean, again, I think it's important that you hear it from me. I'm very clear that even though sometimes it can be difficult to get there, because obviously you have to engage in proper planning and political discussion with colleagues across the political spectrum, actually, to get to a level where you are receiving, the right funding for a baseline budget. It's worth doing that because you're being transparent about the real cost to the public purse of the investment you're making, and it does force you, quite rightly, to justify why you're making that reoccurring investment on the basis of risk and improving our service to communities. So I think we've got a track record over the past couple of years of just being a lot more straightforward about what we really think the ongoing cost of things are going to be, than seeking open conversation and challenge, because it's not that we wouldn't expect challenge back to say, well, actually, do you really need to build that into your base budget? Is that a priority set against your plans? So that's our general intent, is really not to try and put stuff out of sight into kind of a reserve spending position, but rather instead build it in. And then obviously at the point you're doing that, it means you can reasonably then use your reserves for shorter term, unexpected, or what they've been set up to do, what they've been earmarked for, while still, of course, and I think this is very important, maintaining that general reserve, because the thing with London and the operating environment is something very unexpected can happen. We've seen it. So that's our general principle, and it's our aim to have the difficult conversations transparently at the earliest opportunity to understand whether we can deliver our priorities and it's built into the base, rather than perhaps what has maybe happened in the past.
Yeah, sorry, Fiona, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, briefly, because unlike Mostaque, I was around when the budget flexibility reserve was established, and I think Assembly Member Desai might have been on the Fire Authority at the time. I'm trying to remember. I think this is one of the first meetings where we don't have a number of people who were also on the Fire Authority at the time. And I just wanted to sort of go back, and I think Mostaque's right about why it was established. And it was established to make sure that we planned ahead and smoothed the anticipated budget gap, effectively to make sure that the LFB didn't have to go through the drastic cuts we'd seen earlier in the sort of previous administration. But it was, and it's important to remember, it was agreed on a cross-party basis. So this was a cross-party approach, recognising that in the post-Grenfell scenario we found ourselves in, we felt it was a prudent approach. But I do understand why committee members do come back to this, because quite clearly reserves can only be spent once. So it is government policy to push fire services to use reserves where possible. But I think that moving towards, as the brigade intends to, moving towards a situation in which some of the things that have been funded through reserves, so some of the transformation work that couldn't have happened at the point it did unless we had sort of gone down the route of the fire brigade drawing on reserves, they do need to be sort of part of the core budget, and increasingly I think that's the approach that Mostaque and his team have been taking. And the only other point I wanted to make was, as well as this committee scrutinising, it is something that we discuss regularly, and the Mayor's Chief of Staff regularly asks the Commissioner and Mostaque about sort of the use of reserves and how we're going to sort of make sure it's sustainable going forward. But we also have the challenge from the Brigade's Audit Committee and from the external auditors who obviously look at this and make sure that it's a sustainable approach that's being adopted. So I think it is right that the committee picks up on it, because we do as well. But I think that I'm confident that the approach that's being taken is part of a sustainable approach going forward, and we'll continue to move towards that.
Thank you. If I may just add one area which we do note in our budget submission is a big part of our investment proposals from this year is a step change in training and modern firefighting, both in terms of training and equipment and development of firefighters, increasing the course length. And that is a substantial uplift, which we have used one of our reserves, the Fire Safety Improvement Reserve, for kind of 20 million over the next 2 years. But we have also been clear that that will require discussion with local and national government about the long-term sustainability of funding that. We have been fortunate that we have that reserve for the 2 years, but that is an area which is, the scale of it, I think, suggests a discussion around long-term funding.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was going to be one of my next questions. Well, so if you could also give a bit more detail, Andy, on what that will entail. Let
me be clear to this committee. I will be coming to both the Mayor and to central government to discuss that, because I'm in a place, having obviously been the incident commander at the Grenfell Tower fire, where I saw the end results of, I'm afraid, despite the incredible heroism of firefighters, the consequences of taking your initial firefighter training course from 20 weeks down to 11 weeks. That is not a decision I would ever have supported. It's not a decision I will sustain. So we're going back to a place where that's now changed to 15 weeks. and we're putting firefighters from April back into a proper real fire training environment, because the facilities we've had in London are excellent, but due to emissions rules simply can't replicate a full open burn in the way I need London firefighters to be trained. I am unembarrassed about asking for that level of investment, because I think it was not the right decision in the first place to present the training offer as it was. I fully accept that for colleagues who preceded me, they were operating in the context of a different understanding about risk. So it's not a criticism levelled at individuals, but we simply understand the risk environment in a different way now, and it's clear from the forensic analysis done particularly within the Grenfell Tower inquiry process that we have to train firefighters better in London, and that will cost, because there is over 5,000 of them, and we should stop pretending that the current boundaries of the Babcock contract are sufficient to do that, because they are not. And I've been clear in previous committees as to that reality, as clear as I have been into the Grenfell Tower inquiry as well. So I am seeking that investment because I believe it is operationally required, and we are, beginning that process because I think we have no other choice to ensure that Londoners are safe. So we are starting responsibly with what we have within the budget process currently, the reserves we can call upon to begin that process and deliver against our initial ambition. But to sustain it, we will need additional funding, and I will be unembarrassed in coming and asking for that. And I have no doubt that the challenge I will receive will be, we may well consider it, but you will have to demonstrate how you are making efficiencies to also contribute to the cost of that. I'm well aware of how this will unfold, but in the meantime, we will start because it is an absolute operational requirement to do so.
Okay. So your plan in terms of future sustainability of that spending that you're committing to in terms of training is obviously, first of all, to pitch to government and the Mayor? Absolutely.
And to give ourselves the time to do that and provide the full evidence and give people time to make a decision around what's the significant investment. That's really why we've taken the approach we have, which is to begin the programme, which will get through the first cycle of all 5,000 odd firefighters, will significantly improve the training offer for all of them, regardless of future investment, and enable immediate better delivery out onto the incident, into our incident response. And then we will have to do, as I've said, in line with the principles I've laid out, we will have to engage with our colleagues in both central government and with colleagues in local government, particularly inside the GLA, to understand how we will finance that moving forward. It will be built into future budget processes transparently. We'll be clear about what we can and can't deliver on that basis. But I'm clear it is an absolute operational requirement to do it.
Obviously, I'm sitting next to my colleague Anne Clark, who represents Barnet and Camden, who share a border with Brent and Harrow, and we have had residents impacted more frequently than in the past with basement flooding. And it's an issue that I think is affecting Londoners even more, and we've seen the severe weather that has impacted the whole country as well as parts of London in recent weeks as well. How is the LFB ensuring that there's adequate funding to ensure it can respond to incidents of flooding? And also, what impact does not having the statutory responsibility to deal with flooding have on the LFB as well?
Yeah, so I'll perhaps start at the final part of the question. I think we should have a statutory responsibility for incident response in flooding. It's more complex than saying it's the whole thing, because obviously there's a very important role for Environment Agency and local authorities in what is very often a very expensive and time-consuming recovery process for communities. But I think we should have the statutory responsibility for flooding in the response phase, because we're the best people at responding and the best people at coordinating that response. So actually that statutory responsibility, while I think it should be supported by funding, is less of a finance issue, more of a clarity issue, which says actually we're the people who hold responsibility in almost every other hazard environment for command and control. We should just have it for flooding, because I've been a national flood rescue advisor where there isn't that clarity. You end up having to go through quite a difficult process of negotiation with all sorts of parties at the point a response is happening around who has primacy of kind of command and control. So that's the main reason for me, if you're asking my opinion as Commissioner, why we need that statutory responsibility, because it makes it very clear that we take the lead as an agency, which we inevitably always do. At that point, we saw it recently, last weekend in London. That's London firefighters and officers responding in the immediacy in Hackney Wick to kind of evacuate 70-plus residents and ensure their safety. In terms of our actual response, we've got a very well-developed flood response in London. Every single London firefighter is already trained to provide basic response in the context of a flooding environment. whilst any inward investment from central government around statutory responsibility would be welcome or suggested additional funding, actually it'd be wrong of me to say that we haven't already got a very well developed flood response. We have 10 specialist water rescue capable units. We've got specialist flood response. We've got a number of national flood rescue advisors. So I think our response is already pretty well developed. We'd always seek to improve, but there's not a glaring need for an investment from my point of view at this juncture around that. It's already baked into kind of our operational planning and cost. And I think we're well equipped. What would help would be clarity around the multi-agency response in the initial phase, which is your statutory duty.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something very neatly on the multi-agency part of the response and planning and prevention of surface water flooding. So the basement flood issue is a very live issue, and it's one that the Resilience Forum has developed materials on, which should be promoted in areas where there's a higher risk. There's a very real risk to life if it's not managed and mitigated properly, and that's why we've put resources into the basement flat flooding in particular. So just to advise the committee in the wider sense of, I support everything the Commissioner said about the statutory responsibility, but it is something that's already being done. And part of it is, why not give the fire service a statutory responsibility when that's already being done routinely? And I agree that I don't think that particularly would require new resources, but what is something that does require resources is for all partners locally to look at what can be done to prevent. I think it's not an automatic thing that if it rains basement flats will be flooded. So it is also about working with partners to make sure that gullies are cleared, particularly when the weather forecast indicates that. I've spoken to firefighters who've lifted plastic bags off drain covers, and people's homes have been flooded literally because a plastic bag hasn't been cleared from over a drain cover. So this is all not rocket science. It is increasing because of climate change, but there are very real things that communities can do. So from a City Hall perspective, we've invested in some of the community resilience projects. So I think this isn't necessarily sort of fire related, but I just wanted to put it in context. And we've also got a new chair of the London Surface Water Strategic Group who's starting in the new year. I can't see, because I've just Googled it, so apologies to use my phone, that's been publicly announced. So I'm not going to sort of say who the chair is, but we're really excited that that's going to move forward. And clearly the fire brigade, because of their role in response already, is one of the key partners in that piece of work as well.
Can I just place one sort of final point on the record, really, and it's a bit of a caveat, which is, as it stands at the moment, today, literally today in London, I am satisfied we have a really well-considered response to major flooding. But that is continuously under review, because one of the things we've learned in terms of the impact of climate change is that things can shift quite quickly. If you look at, for example, wildfire, where we experienced continental firefighting conditions that we had never experienced in the UK on the rural kind of urban interface of London, your planning assumptions can shift quite quickly. Now, with flooding, we have seen very major widespread flooding in London repeatedly. So it's not that I don't think our resources are sufficient, because we've demonstrated we can respond effectively. But that does have to come under continuous review, because if we started to see, for example, in the urban geography of London, some of the very fast-moving water incidents we've seen in some other parts of the country, you have had them in London, but not on a scale. For example, I went up to Cumbria as a national flood rescue advisor. I went down to Surrey and the Somerset levels. You know, you saw some very dangerous circumstances there where you need a greater level of what is deemed swift water rescue trained personnel. Now that does cost, because that's a much more complex training methodology and you need different kit to respond. Now, most flooding doesn't exist in that space, even when it's widespread and very difficult for the residents. If we start to see something that more regularly that encompass that level of risk, then we would naturally have to come back to resourcing. But it would be wrong to predict that on the basis of what we know so far and what has happened in London in terms of surface water drainage, the geography of the space that doesn't particularly lend itself to that. So I'm satisfied with where we are at the moment, but that is something that is subject to continual review, not least within the CRMP process and our annual and ongoing assessment of operational risk in London.
Okay. No, thanks. Thanks for that candid answer. I'm going to go back to reserve Mostaque. Just looking at sort of the forecast going ahead in 2 years' time, it looks like the reserve is forecast to be drawn down to about £38 million. In terms of, from a finance perspective, are you comfortable with that level?
I am.
Sorry, microphone.
Thank you. Yes, I am. It's in the context of our overall budget, yes, because the reductions are primarily in the earmark reserves. As I mentioned earlier, we're maintaining the general reserve, and obviously the budget flexibility reserve has largely fulfilled its purpose for the period it has. Clearly, we will keep that under review, and obviously if new emerging pressures and changing risks come along in the way that the Commission described, then we will have to review that. But it's something we regularly review in terms of the adequacy and necessity of the size of the reserve.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Just before we move on, actually, something you were saying struck me about the training, specifically the environmental regulations that prevent you doing the sort of open burn training. And I'm assuming what that is where you have a large sort of open fire, big thing burning outdoors, and you're training people to put that out. Seems like a important part of firefighter training to me. And you said presumably you have to go to the home counties, do you, to do that kind of training? And it struck me that creates a risk that obviously they might introduce the same kind of air quality regulations that we have, which then would leave us where? So, and I suppose specifically, have you asked for an exemption that would allow you to do that? Because I would imagine that probably the people who conceive of those regulations wouldn't mind if firefighters were using it, because obviously that wouldn't be just...
We might get to that point. I think it's an entirely reasonable question to ask. So we've got sophisticated live fire training facilities in London, but what you have to do is extract the products of consumption of combustion immediately. Now that technology is continuously changing, so we might get to a place where we can more realistically kind of deliver open burn training in London within basically a hermetically sealed environment. But it comes at cost. But to their credit, our training providers are looking at that alongside us taking London firefighters outside of London in the first instance, either to the home counties or most likely to the National Fire Service College down at Moulton in the Marsh. You could see, as we begin to understand the damage of open burn emissions more, comprehensively, that you could see further prohibition in other parts of the country. At that point, we would make very strong representation as a sector that you simply cannot train firefighters effectively without some sort of access to open burn, and we would have to seek an exemption. It's not come yet, but it's definitely in people's minds, because you're not the first person within the political context from across the political spectrum again who's asked me that question. And we are talking about reassuring people in ministerial positions of decision making who I think quite rightly have that in their mind as well, and about making sure that the fire service becomes part of the conversation if they need to. So I think it's a good question, but it's one we're addressing. And I think the answer in the first instance is simply to go where there isn't an exemption, and where actually you've got more space available to deliver training in a more complex built environment. That's what LFB is doing. So from April, we'll be going back to the Fire Service College to deliver part of our training while still maintaining our facilities in London.
Okay. Assembly Member Polanski, I believe you had a question.
Actually, the Commissioner keeps answering my questions before I can ask them, so that's great. Thank you.
Got your precognition turned on, Commissioner. In that case, our next question is from Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions for Mostaque. The first one, what plans are in place to achieve the 3.8 million in savings and 2.7 million in efficiencies required for 2024-2025?
Okay, thank you. The 3.8 million of departmental savings, they've been listed out in our budget submission in full. So we've kind of itemised all of those. They include savings across a range of departments. For example, in ICT, if I just pick on some examples, on ICT, we've got a new mobile phone contract. We've latched on to a contract with the Met Police, and that's much kind of cheaper was providing the same service compared to that. We've got forecast increase in our Metropolitan Fire Brigade income forecast from insurers. But we've kind of listed that out in terms of the numbers that make up that total. In terms of the efficiency review savings, obviously we've through the Investment and Finance Board, which I chair, we've got a regular kind of rolling review of savings opportunities. Of that figure, you mentioned the 2.7 million, 1.5 million of that, so the bulk of that relates to a review we did of the operational supports units, which provide lots of kind of logistical and equipment support. We're reviewing that in the light of some of the changing risks that the Commissioner talked about in terms of wildfires, etc., since we did that review, but we still expect there to be savings possible whilst delivering and maintaining the kind of risk management approach. And we will continue to kind of do further reviews across our different expenditures to identify the balance of that 2.7 million.
Okay, thank you. And so do you think that those two targets will be achieved?
Yes, so yes, that's, I mean, we put in targets which we believe are realistic to aim for and deliver. And, you know, if I look at this year's kind of departmental savings, they are being delivered largely in line with the forecast we made. The one big exception for this year, which we're deferring to next year, is the one I mentioned about operational support units, but that's because since we did that review, we had the experience of the summer wildfires, which is making us look at how we deploy our logistical support assets in the light of changing risks. So it's not saying we're not going to deliver that savings, but it's actually looking at it in a wider context of changing risks, really.
Okay, thank you. My next question then, to what extent are the emergency service...
I think that was you indicating to come in. Somebody, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Looking down when somebody was waving.
I did indicate I wanted to come in and hopefully the point I'm going to make is helpful. I think that are the savings achievable? Yes. And I think the reason we can be reasonably confident that the savings are achievable is because of the improved business processes internally within the fire service. I think it's very easy to forget that transformation of the fire brigade has not just been of the approach to fighting fires or of the culture, but also of the whole business approach and the sort of the planning and the challenge processes that happens routinely. And I think it's not the most exciting thing to talk about, but in the context of this committee, I think that's a really important point to make. I think that the main thing for me has been historically there's been really poor understanding by staff of phasing of their budget bids, and that's one of the things that has still got a way to go. But if you're predicting spend for a project and you predict that there's too much spend in the first year of that project, that's actually money that you don't have to save. If you accurately sort of predict how much you're going to spend on a project, that's a much better approach to that can help you avoid having to make efficiency elsewhere. So I think there's a much greater understanding within the fire brigade that actually one overestimation of how quickly a project can go, and I call it the sort of the optimism bias within the brigade, that people are sometimes a bit optimistic about how fast they can implement things or how fast projects can be delivered. If you remove that optimism bias and make them much more realistic about when they need the money for a particular project, you actually can avoid some of the hazards of poor budgetary planning. And I think a lot of that has already been improved, and I know it's something that Mostaque and the Commissioner will continue to push on.
Yeah, and actually you can provide some tangible examples of that. So a good example is actually the future pressure on budget around training and anticipated cost of a massive expansion of training. And I don't mean this particularly critically of my colleagues, but we still lack maturity around cost planning from operational officers because we've not provided them the education. Historically, you didn't get any education around kind of project management and future and building your budget properly into that. The difference between then and now is that I've got some really good safeguards. So I've got a monthly investment and finance board. I've got a transformation board, effectively, so that performance board, I've got a risk and audit committee that sits independently that quite rightly point to it. And I have been criticised in the past for investing in, you know, somewhat dull and worthy professional services, as kind of Fiona has alluded to. So we've brought in a lot of project managers and people who understand how to do project planning and how to plan budgets against projects. And, you know, I have been criticised on previous FREPs for that, rather than putting it into the operational front line. What I would say is I'm now seeing the end delivery of that, because that training bill that we've just discussed has reduced in the millions due to the scrutiny and challenge that came from inside IFB. The original proposals around both the phasing and cost of changing our training model were millions of pounds more expensive before they hit that challenge process. And we've helped colleagues and educated them a bit, and it's been very useful for them to learn that actually if you understand your phasing, if you understand the overall possible trajectory of delivery, i.e. how many people can you actually train in 1 year rather than what you think you can. I know this sounds like basic stuff. You can actually really change the way you manage your budget, but you can only do that if you've got people who've got those professional skills to really provide the challenge, look at it objectively, you know, push back against kind of, frankly, operational colleagues who are very experienced in delivering our response, but perhaps do have that optimism bias. So that's not to be critical. They're working really hard and delivering real change, and that process of education is ongoing. But we still do need to mature in that space. But having the safeguards is what makes a difference. You know, Mostaque is quietly ruthless chairing that board, and rightly so, and unpicking the logic of people's reasoning. So I hope again that provides some sort of reassurance to the committee that we're trying to approach this objectively.
Yep. Thank you very much for the context there. And back to Mostaque for my next question. To what extent are the emergency services network costs covered by the Home Office?
Thank you. It's fair to say the estimation of costs still a bit uncertain because of where the programme is. It's a national programme led by the Home Office. We are part of that, engaged on that, as with other services, but the programme has suffered, the national programme has suffered with delays. So the figures we have are the estimates available to us, but we're obviously keeping that under review, not least because the engagement with the Home Office on the details is still ongoing around that.
And what are the latest timescales?
I'd probably have to come back. I can come back to the committee.
That's fine. I think colleagues may have supplementaries on this, so I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. I have a supplementary from Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you. Just on the emergency services network, I mean, it'd be good if you can give us detail of, as much as you can, of the timescale and any costs associated with it, but also any costs associated with extending the life of your current equipment, Airwave or whatever it's called.
Absolutely, yes. It is called Airwave, the current system. So obviously we've got that in our base budget at the moment. We do expect the new system, the emergency services network, new programme, to have a different cost profile, and that's where that uncertainty is. But we will kind of write in terms of an update around that.
I think so, but it's been some time and this project seems to be dragging on and on endlessly, so that would be helpful. I also wanted to pick up an issue around reserves, and apologies if this was covered earlier. I seem to have lost the connection for a bit. But previously, Commissioner, you talked to us about not being in the right place using reserves, and we've had a big discussion that I've heard about a part of that and about putting stuff into your core budgets. Last year, you said you talked about getting structures and systems in place so you don't rely on reserves. Can you outline for me what's changed in the last 12 months in terms of systems and structures to make sure that things that should be business as usual are in the core budget, and any other changes you've made to make sure that you're not dipping into reserves when it's not appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, we did discuss this at some length within the committee, but I think it's worth reiterating that we've got a plan for use of reserves in a completely different way that builds on the work that is happening continuously within the Investment and Finance Board, within the Performance and Risk and Assurance Board, within the work of our own Independent Audit Committee. We're constantly coming back to our plan for use of reserves that is both aligned to central government direction that fire services should use their reserves because the national fire sector sits on a very large balance of reserves, actually in contrast to some other sectors, so needs to use it appropriately, but obviously not in a way that then creates an unplanned demand on revenue funding later in an inappropriate way. So our plan is predicated on those principles: appropriate use of reserves, recognising why individual different earmark reserve funding pots were set up, where that demand might have changed, and then being very clear about why we've used it in a different way, and then being utterly transparent, like we have just been discussing about where there's going to be a future draw on revenue budget, for example, for training, or where we've already built it into the baseline, have had to do the hard work to kind of justify asking for funding, for example, in respect to maternity provision, for example. So I think we have a plan which we could articulate across almost every area of use of reserves that says we're using it for this, this is what we're left with, this is how we maintain a general contingency, this is why it's justified, and this is where we might, for example, like with training, have a future pressure on revenue, but being absolutely upfront about it in the context of what we put into our budget papers. Mostaque, would you perhaps like to?
Yes, thank you. What I've seen over the past year, which is your question, the changes, is improvement in the maturity of both the budget planning process at LFB. So, for example, we've built in a business case process for each of our programs which sit under the CRMP that has engagement with not only the project sponsors but also finance and procurement and other enabling support services earlier on in the process, so that we are better at predicting and forecasting with better accuracy than perhaps in the past. The business case process and the challenge process that goes with that provides more rigour in terms of the accuracy of numbers, but also getting people to think about whether something is really kind of needed, and justify how it aligns with our priorities set out in the CRMP, and also challenging around offsetting costs for proposals where people are asking for more money. And another area is actually getting people to think about the whole life cost, not just the initial upfront cost, but actually what does it cost to maintain that, or if it's a capital investment, actually what's the replacement cycle. So I'm seeing kind of much more. We've still got more to do, but I'm seeing much more of a maturity in those areas as well.
And I think, just to add to that, probably the biggest change, and it's the one you sort of forget because it's so fundamental to our business, is the CRMP. So what we had previously, in my first sort of period as Commissioner, we were operating to a London safety plan that was simply out of date. It was just simply out of date. It was speaking to a historic risk. It was looking to diminish rather than invest against a risk we knew that had emerged, particularly in the built environment. The CRMP is very, very clear in its stated objectives in where it wants to take us over the next period, with enough flexibility built within it to accommodate changing risk, for example, in relation to climate. And that is really the planning assumption to which we work the whole time. It's what we hold our colleagues to, whereas because we were operating to begin with against a plan that was frankly out of date, it allows people to kind of present their own agenda, doesn't it? Whereas when you've got a very clearly stated picture in terms of operational risk you're seeking to mitigate, and a very clear plan that prioritises your investment in that context, it gives people that guidance immediately coming into those kind of processes that Mostaque has described, and it's much easier to hold people to account.
Yes, it sounds to me that you have developed a framework, which you've got your plan, which you're operating against, but also the investment in management that is enabling you to make those decisions which you would expect in an organisation, but clearly hadn't been happening within the fire service. And, there may well be lessons there for some of the other functional bodies, to be honest, because, we have police before us later this afternoon, and actually constantly they're struggling within their budgets and in terms of capital programme and so on. So it may well be there's some lessons there. Thank you, Chair.
I think that's an entirely fair characterisation. And actually, again, in defence of my operational colleagues, I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned is you need to educate, because you can be a very, very, very experienced, highly competent operational officer who you would trust your life with, frankly, and you would trust to run a major incident. That is not the same as having been given proper financial education in the context of budget planning, allocation and phasing of a project. And that was the mistake we made repeatedly in the historic era, which is that people were entirely demonstratively competent. But you can't expect people to be competent in that space unless you provide them with the education. A lot of the process that Mostaque is describing is in itself in education, because people are facing challenge for the first time and are having to, in a supported way, go back and think about their planning assumptions and how it actually works within the context of available finance and a budget cycle. That has been a bit of a revelation for us.
Different skill set that we need them. So lovely, thank you, Chair.
Okay, I suppose we've sort of been talking about capital already, but we're moving on to a section specifically about capital with Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Chair. And indeed, we have touched on capital a number of times, but this is a nice, tidy section. And congratulations again, Andy, on your award. Andy, I mean, quite simply, how do you prioritise your capital programme?
Against the CRMP. And it's got to be, because if we don't hold ourselves to a discipline, again, we become reckless. So everything you see in that capital budget is characterised within the CRMP, including, because capital is quite important in this context, just maintenance of business as usual, i.e. your buildings don't fall down, because we've got 103 of them. Some of them are quite old. So there's a maintenance piece alongside forward investment, obviously, as well. But the simple answer is the CRMP. And what I would say, again, just to be utterly transparent, is we have done better with capital, but we can do better still. So it's an area we definitely weren't in the right place with when Mostaque joined LFB. He's done a lot of work, to his credit, to get us in a much better place. But I think Mostaque would be the first to admit that there's still some more mileage in that, isn't there? And perhaps you might want to speak to that.
Absolutely. So clearly for the LFB, given the nature of our assets, our biggest areas are around the properties, maintaining and enhancing, including, for example, I mentioned the Privacy for All program earlier. Fleet is another big area where clearly we need to kind of replace, we have a cycle of replacing our fleets, as well as operational equipment. We have, for example, in the past, RP investments, respiratory protective equipment. The other big area is IT, which has become increasingly important for any organisation in terms of modernising and providing the tools for people. So our forward capital programme reflects all of those areas, and in doing so, we obviously also have an eye to contributing to a carbon net zero agenda. So in the way we invest in our properties and fleet, increasingly that's becoming an important consideration in terms of how and when we invest in capital. The Commissioner's right in terms of this time last year, our in-year capital, we were somewhere like 50% underspent last year, and that's poor forecasting, planning, optimism bias that the Deputy Mayor talked about, etc., a range of factors. This year, much improved. I mean, our Q2 position was against a budget of 35 million. We were looking to spend about 30 million. So whilst there's still room for improvement, it's a vastly improved position. And that reflects all the things we talked about earlier in terms of business cases involving procurement and finance much earlier in the process, etc.
Yeah, thank you for that. And while we're on fleet, I'm just wondering if you or Andy could provide an update on where we are with the planned fleet replacement.
Yes. So obviously we've got a range. Fleet covers a range of assets that we have. So an example is our officer pool cars. We replaced 50 of them with fully electric. Those are now in place. So that reflects both a necessary investment because the previous fleet for officer pool cars had come to the end of life, but we did it in a way that also contributes to our carbon net zero. Obviously, we have a rolling program of replacement for our fire engine appliances, which have a longer life scale between 10 and 15 years. So our forward investment plan has a regular replacement cycle. Clearly, I think this committee members will probably be aware we have a trial running at the moment for Zero Emission Public Alliance, which is an innovation in the sector. We are kind of leading the charge in terms of trialling that. It is in the trial stage, and we're still kind of learning on that, and we're still training more people to be able to kind of deal with that. But those are some of the kind of areas for our kind of fleet replacement strategy.
I was going to sort of let Mostaque sort of give you the spread of the detail, but one of the challenges for us is around net zero, because obviously we've got a very well established baselined contract around fleet and fleet replacement, which I'm very confident in. It's well priced, it's well costed, it works well as well. Our fleet contract is a good operation, actually. We've got a bigger existential question to answer, which is, do we go electric? Do we have a mix of technologies? Is there the infrastructure to support it? What physical infrastructure do we need sitting behind the fleet to support whatever decision we make? And that covers all sorts of things. For example, if we do something in the interim around biodiesel, do we have the bulk storage we need to maintain our operational response if we buy biodiesel, for example, recycled vegetable oil, basically, to provide an interim position that improves our carbon net zero profile, whilst anticipating future technology change? Because we've got to be a bit careful, I think. I've had quite a lot of discussions at government level about emerging technology, whether that's in respect to hydrogen-powered HGVs or full electric or hybrid, because obviously as an emergency service, you're only as good as the infrastructure that supports your response. So we've got to be careful not to put all our money into one solution without being very, very, very confident that we will continue to deliver the best attendance times in the world, which is what we have at the moment for a fire and rescue service in a global city. So these are quite big questions that fall outside of the contract for fleet and are only going to be answered by changing technology, which is obviously moving almost as quickly as kind of the planning that we need to undertake in advance to deliver it. So it's quite a complex question to answer, because we're not really sure what the final shape of vehicle delivery will be. And I think we've got to hedge our bets a bit. I think we've got to look very, very carefully at what is really sustainable and what can really deliver that response, is my personal opinion. And that's kind of the discussions we're having at a executive level, is making sure that we don't just say, oh yeah, it's all going to be electric, when we've got to have absolute confidence that we can deliver the response, which is our statutory our statutory responsibility.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Sorry, Fiona, did you want to come in?
No, I was just agreeing with the Commissioner on that final point. I think it needs to be really carefully thought through in terms of the pace at which the LFB rightly sees itself as innovator in the space of the zero emissions pumping appliance, and but that sort of innovation also has risks that may or may not be acceptable at this particular point in time when you're looking at the fleet replacement. So that's all very live discussions, and I know it's something maybe we can look at a bit more again at FREP.
Yeah, I agree. Interestingly, I would not go too off piece, but I visited a bus garage recently with Krupesh, actually, and very much the mix of vehicles came up in terms of charging and that sort of thing. Mostaque, I'm going to come back to you. Obviously, we have, across the country, borrowing costs are going up. How do you plan to address this increase in borrowing costs for capital expenditure?
Thank you. So I think for the LFB, there's a range of challenges. One is that up to now, we have been fortunate in terms of how we've been able to finance our capital investment because of previous capital receipts from both from previous land sales or closure of fire stations a long time ago. And that has meant that to date, we haven't really had to, over the last few years, rely on external borrowing. Clearly, as those receipts have been used up, looking forward, there are more limited opportunities. So we're in a more, I would say, conventional space with local government where you largely fund your capital investment through borrowing costs. So that change in approach we've built into our budget projections, which has been one of the big pressures in terms of our medium-term financial plan, but we've kind of tried to predict that. which is a pressure that wasn't there in the last few years, but historically has been there, and it has come back. Secondly, as you've rightly said, in terms of borrowing costs are higher. Obviously we have access to the PWLB kind of rates as with other local governments, and we're feeling the impacts of that. But again, it's about planning for that, and obviously the future remains uncertain about how quickly or not the Bank of England changes may then feed through. But we've kind of been prudent in our assumptions around that. I think what I'd also say is where we can access other forms of funding of the borrowing, obviously we try and do that. So one of the areas in terms of our capital investment linked to the carbon net zero agenda is around improving and upgrading our electricity infrastructure in fire stations, because if you're going to move away from gas to electric, actually you need the appropriate capacity. So we did a business case which was supported by the Deputy Mayor and GLA, and we've applied for and recently been notified of being successful in applying for green financing, which provides interest rate subsidy. We're just in discussion about the level of that subsidy at the moment. So that does reduce our borrowing costs for that particular investment. And where we can also access alternative sources of grant funding. So we have been successful in the past for the government's SALIX funding, which is the public sector decarbonisation, where they provided for 5 fire stations in terms of air source, heat pump, etc. They provided 1/3 of the. It's a very competitive process, but we were successful for 5, and we recently applied for similar funding for 9 more stations, and we're hoping that will be successful again. So through all those actions, we're trying to reduce the cost of borrowing for funding our capital investment.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. I think, Chair, that final question has been answered.
I think it probably has. Just a little bit conscious of time. We've got one more section to come on climate budgeting, which will come back to some of the issues we just touched on. I have first, though, a supplementary question from Assemblymember Pigeon in the capital section.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to pick up where Albert Embankment Fire Station features in your budget plans for the year ahead. In April last year, you stated there was no planning application before December. We're now beyond that. Just wondering where that features here, because clearly that has the potential to grant you a significant capital receipt.
We were anticipating this question. I've got a tab in my pack. It's completely unsurprising. So obviously the sort of sorry story of 8 Albert Embankment is one that I inherited as Commissioner. Since the Secretary of State's decision in 2021 to refuse planning permission, although we'd cleared the boundaries locally and with the GLA, we've been considering our options with the aim of securing a different future for that site. We have to have the site. Strategically, it is our most important fire station in central London because it covers the majority of the government security zone. If we moved out of there isn't other options. We've looked hard. And actually, it's very important anyway in the context of the kind of the history and kind of representation of one of the world's largest emergency services to maintain that site. We've done a lot of detailed consideration around feedback from the local community on previous plans. We're going through another iteration, and I'm grateful actually to the developers who we've partnered with that they've stood the course of this. A lot of other people might have walked away, but they've, to be fair, justified their choice as responsible developers in kind of continuing that partnership. We are committed to engaging with local residents and businesses to try and find a solution down on that site that is amenable to everyone. But I do need to be clear, and I take this opportunity in every public committee meeting to say that regardless of the difficulties of the local planning decisions, London needs a fire station in that space. It's one of the most densely populated and deprived boroughs in London, with an enormous amount of risk, particularly in the high-rise environment. It covers the majority of the government security zone. Whatever happens in relation to the balance of development, housing, cost to the public purse, the baseline set against my statutory duties is I need a fire station there. That's the honest answer. The delay in the planning process means that obviously we've moved the capital receipt assumption from 24-25 in last year's plan to 25-26 in the current draft budget proposal. But there's great uncertainty around it because we're operating in an environment where there's multiple other factors. You know, the viability of any development scheme set against the cost of construction, the pressures on developers, the change in regulatory environment, of course, that we're at the centre of, whether it's, you know, twin staircases, whether it's better construction standards and what that does to margins, all of those things, ironically, we're at the centre of in a different space, all impacts on that scheme. And again, just to be clear, we haven't got lots of alternatives because I'm afraid there's a lot of developers in London and nationally the London Fire Brigade would not partner with because we have issue with them in another regulatory space. So I could, you know, I won't do it here, but I could list you those developers that we would not be able credibly to do business with because we're holding them to hard account elsewhere. So I think that brings us back to the fact that there is uncertainty. We've pushed it into the following year's budget in terms of the assumptions. It will be reduced. I've got no doubt about that.
There's a reduced to some as well.
It will have to be, but I can't put a metric on it because there's too many other variables, and that's not being evasive. It's not on the basis of commercial confidentiality. It's just very, very, very difficult to predict at this point because there's so many factors in there, everything from grants in relation to housing to the size of the scheme dependent on how the community feel about it now, because quite rightly I think they're tired of it. You think about these 13, 14 years of planning failure, really. So that's the answer, is that we know it will probably end up with a reduced capital receipt. We don't know quite what that is, but we aim to keep on pushing on because it's one of the things I do want to achieve as Commissioner. I want that site secured and redeveloped because I need it.
I think that's right. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we now move on to our final section, which is climate budgeting. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. There's 47 unfunded climate actions that you've alluded to a few times in your budget. What are the funding options that are currently under consideration to secure funding for them? Commissioner.
Okay, if I start, thank you. Yes, so it's worth bearing in mind that we've kind of projected forward to 2030 in terms of meeting the ambition set by the Mayor and adopted by ourselves, because we believe that is the right approach. That over that period to 2030, there's about 100 million of funding from our core capital budgets which contribute to that. So that's to begin with. Then there's that's probably represent about 1/3, and then there's 2/3, so just over 200 million pounds, which is the unfunded element, which includes all the listing you talk about. Clearly, we continue to look at options around that, both within, in terms of our own budget and how we prioritise, as well as discussions with local and national government. Obviously, we have had support from the Mayor in terms of some of, for example, I mentioned the green financing, but also I mentioned in answer to a previous question about looking out for opportunities for central government grant funding, and SALIX is an example where we have been successful, and we hope there's more of that approach. So we realise that this is an ambitious target. Funding is a challenge, and we will keep looking for every opportunity to achieve that. I think the Commission will want to come in, but what I would also probably just add in terms of the challenge is, as well as the finance challenge, it's also a market challenge, particularly when it comes to heavy vehicle goods, our fire engines, because we can help to stimulate the market, but actually we need the market itself to kind of move forward to enable us to meet fully realise the benefits from decarbonising the heavy goods vehicle fleet as well. So it's both the finance and the market challenge.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you, Commissioner.
This is a major existential question, isn't it? That's got to be answered at a society level, and we're no different as a large organisation in London. So I'm well aware that we've got one of the biggest HGV fleets in London. I've got 103 buildings. I employ thousands of people. We've got to do our bit. You know, regardless of where you sit on the spectrum of debate around this issue, you know, I think there's a general consensus that something is happening, and we all need to act responsibly. If we lead large organisations, we're very much in support of both central government and local government, regardless of, you know, politics, ambitions around this. And I've had it laid out really clearly to me from both central and regional government in the form of Mayor, Minister, Secretaries of State, that we need to do our bit. So we're completely on board with that. We are not the biggest organisation within the GLA family, so it gives you an idea of the sort of metrics when I tell you that to get to net zero, outside of the investment that we've already budgeted for, which is reasonable and kind of set against achievable expectation in the context of technology and what we can do. Getting to net zero would require an additional £127.4 million within the transport budget and £109.7 million in property. So that's totalling about, £240 million. Now, if you extrapolate that out, that's across all the functional bodies. Clearly, there's a question that has to be answered at a governmental level about how we invest in this area as a country, what is reasonable, how far we move on it in the context of available technology. But to be clear, we will get LFB as far as we can because we are committed to it. Beyond that point, we have to finance it. And I don't think there's an organisation out there of our size or larger that has got the answer to it yet. So we're seeking those answers when we're actively engaged in the debate. And again, credit to my colleagues from across the political spectrum. I think people are quietly grappling with this and trying to understand how they're going to support us. We've had very good support up to this point, but we're now hitting that threshold where we really just do need very significant inward investment. And it's investment of a scale that isn't as simple as just saying, well, we're going to vary the budget next year. That's not the reality of the situation we're in, nor any other large functional body.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. So last week I was caught up in the flooding in Hackney, and the fire officers there were excellent. There was about 9 fire engines, and they were excellent, particularly with their impact on the boating community there. I was in Worcestershire yesterday and saw the flooding there. I jar a little bit when you say the debate that's going on, because you're doing excellent work, and I think you'd accept that this isn't a debate at this point, as in you've worked in flooding before. We know that this needs to happen.
No, absolutely. I'm not... Yeah, sorry, if I've presented it that way, just to be clear, from my point of view operationally, you take all of the politics out of this, and sometimes politics can come into it. And there's no criticism there. There is a debate to be had about pace, scale, the science, all of it. But at a basic level, this is a very real risk that is multiplying exponentially year on year. I know that. When I was first trained as a National Flood Rescue Advisor, if we talk about flood rescue, we were talking about 100 and 200-year events and how you might respond. Within 2 years of being trained in that role, we were talking about the fact that those flood maps were out of date because 100 and 200-year events were becoming yearly, 2-yearly, 5-yearly events. You've only got to look at about how many times the Thames Barrier has gone up over the course of its life from when it was first commissioned to the amount of times it's used now. And I fully accept there is a different operating model as well that has impacted that. You can just see that the combination of increased urbanisation, increasing extreme weather events, the geography of rivers in London, if we're talking about the risk in London itself, the risk is it's expanding exponentially. Outside of the wildfires in 2022, our busiest day since the Second World War, actually, I think, was in 2021, almost a year in advance of the wildfires, to very, very serious widespread surface water flooding that put Londoners at real risk. So you're absolutely right, there isn't a debate. And to be fair, I don't encounter a debate anywhere in the political spectrum when we're sitting down with serious people, ministers, etc. They know full well they're grappling with something that is real and manifest. It's more about how do we pay for it? What is reasonable in the balance of risk versus benefit, I guess, which is happening outside of the walls of the LFB. All I will do is come and ask for what I think I need to deliver to mitigate the risk for Londoners, and that will come at a cost.
Thank you. And you always are excellent on this. You'll understand I'm just particularly sensitive about the language.
Yeah, absolutely.
What options are available to address the forecast residual carbon emissions by the LFB by 2030?
Yeah, so I think it's worth just kind of reiterating, first of all, just before I will get to that, in terms of we previously had a target to reduce our carbon emissions against the 1990 base level by 60% by 2025. We've achieved that early. In 22-23, we got to 61%. I think it's just worth noting that clearly the net carbon zero is a much tougher target, which we are signed up to. And when we look at where our baseline emissions are, gas, so 11, the 2021 new baseline, 11,000 tons of carbon emissions. I mean, gas accounts for about nearly 5,000 tons of that. Then we've got buildings, use of electricity, and then our fleet. So those are the kind of key areas. And our approach to dealing with that, takes into account all of those factors. So we developed a strategy that looks at the enabling infrastructure. So, for example, we recently got approval, I mentioned, for upgrading the electrical power, which is an enabler for both the switch to kind of electricity from gas. We've got a program to move away from gas cookers and appliances at fire stations to electricity and also heating. Our approach to energy is that we are part of the Pan-London kind of electricity contract, which enables kind of renewable sources of electricity, and we are also actively discussing with wider GLA group and government about potential power purchase agreement, which would move us even further towards that. Demand management through building management systems, energy portals is a key part of our strategy. I mean, we've had demonstrations of how that is operating in terms of, getting people to understand the implications of actions and some of the behaviours. Commissioner mentioned HVO, hydro-treated vegetable. Obviously, that's not an end solution, but it's better than diesel. So we're piloting that use of that fuel, and ultimately, again, for the longer term, what we do about our heavy goods vehicles is also going to be key in terms of the end game in terms of carbon net zero, where I mentioned the trial we have, but as Commissioner rightly pointed out, that there's a range of tools. So that's our overall strategy. Obviously, our budget submission talks about things we've already done in buildings, fleet, moving away from gas to electricity. The investment in electrical power will open up more options, because at the moment, where we've had to prioritise our movement from gas to electricity is where in stations where we don't need an upgrade. But with that new investment, that will open up more opportunities for further kind of fire stations to be net carbon, like the Walthamstow example where we have done that. So we want to see more of that. So that's our kind of overall approach. And we've obviously, through our revenue and capital plans, we continue to kind of go on that journey in terms of making those improvements.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to make that point again, without sort of hammer it, that without additional funding, we will not meet the net zero target in 2030. We think with some judicious planning, and there has to be some kind of, I think, realistic understanding that we've got 6 years between now and 2030, basically. Things are going to change in the context of technology and available solutions, which is going to change the cost boundaries, potentially. But we think with future funding, what we can put our feet down on, so I think we get to around 89%, don't we? We can reasonably predict around an 89% reduction by 2030 based on current planning assumptions, but obviously with an aim to do better if we secure much larger metrics around the funding, and we see emerging technology that's going to help us. It's very, very difficult to fix the HGV fleet issue at the moment because we haven't really got something yet, I don't think. We'll see how the trials go. That absolutely assures me we're going to provide the response we need to. And I've got to start with that as the operating baseline, because that's our whole purpose, isn't it? If we get that, then that might change.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Presumably the issue is not just just thinking about the HGV fleet. Presumably you've got things like, let's say you have an electric vehicle, it goes out, it comes back, it needs potentially a long charge, and then it's on call again, and that's no good. You need to
you've got to have immediate turnover. So
yeah, these are the challenges.
And also it's pumping. So the big issue isn't actually getting. If it was just about getting the truck there, it probably wouldn't be so much of an issue, because there's already some quite good existing HGV technology. What doesn't exist is the fact you're using the same sort of power uptake over 5, 6, 7 hours to pump water into an incident. So you either need to buy twice the fleet, which needs twice the fire stations, which isn't really justifiable. You've got either that, or you've got to do expensive and complex battery swap out potentially. We need the technology to catch up with the ambition. So getting the truck there is one thing. It's actually the logistical. You're absolutely right. When you get back on a fire station, is making sure that it's immediately available again. And more importantly, sustaining pumping. And we're still not quite there yet, I don't think. We'll have to see the results of the trial to really convince me that we're in the right place.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll all be watching that very closely. Thanks, everyone. I don't see any other indications. In that case, that brings our questioning this morning to an end. I'd like to thank all of our guests for attending. Thank you very much. And for your answers to our questions. Could I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? A couple of quick items then. For summary list of actions, can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions from previous meetings of the committee? And work programme, can I ask the committee to note our work programme and meeting dates? Date of next meeting. If you're a big fan of watching our meetings, I have good news for you, which is that we're meeting again in 58 minutes. The next meeting of this committee is this afternoon at 1 p.m. back here in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for your time.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of